To set up our scene for the final render, what we're going to want to do is add a plane, go into edit mode to scale that up. Scale it up really, really large. Then we're going to move that down so it's below our can. And I can go into front view, zoom out, G, Z, and get that pretty close. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you can spend a little time on that if you want. And then move our plane in place by hitting G and Shift Z to keep it on that Z plane and just move it up until it's basically covering our entire camera view here. Okay, if we just give that a quick render, you can see that this is infinitely better. You can see where our light is over here, casting a nice shadow here, a couple of nice dramatic shadows on the top, a nice kind of edge lighting here that wraps around the can, gives it depth. And now our scene is ready for materials to be added to it. The material that is applied to these by default is a diffuse color, and as you look at it, it diffuses the light that bounces off of it, so it kind of looks a little like clay. If I hit the escape key to get out of here, I'm going to clean up this view a little bit by hitting the N key and the T key. And what I want to do is render this view here. And what Cycles will do is it'll render it as quickly as it can and then add different samples. So as I wait, it gets better and better and better. This is a little fuzzier than our final render. But what's nice about this is we can see this render in real time. And actually, let me undo that because I don't want to move my camera. So as I move that around, it's re-rendering. Now if I go up to this little kind of handle here and click and drag to the left, I can create another view. So on this view, I'm going to hit the 1 key. That's going to go in the front view, rotate this around, and zoom in so it takes up that entire view. For this one, I'm going to split this view down, so click and drag down. So we have something like this. Now I want to have a material editor take up this window, and so what I can do is I can hit this button to change the different view that this is representing. And go down to Node Editor. What Node Editor is a material editor, and the way that we edit materials is through nodes. So right now we don't see anything here, and by default our menu over here gets shown, so let's just hit the N key to get rid of that so we have a bigger view. Make sure our object is selected. You can select it in this view if you want. We have our plane selected, so let's go into object mode first, then select our can. Again, you can do it in this one as well. And go over here, this is going to be our materials tab. And right now we don't have any materials attached to this, it's just using the default diffuse shader. We're going to add a new material, this button here. And now we have a material called material.001. And if we zoom in on this, just use your mouse wheel, we select different colors. So we're going to select red. And again, this is a diffuse color, so it kind of looks a little like clay or plastic or some kind of rougher material, but cans are shiny, they're made out of metal. And this node editor works very, very similar to the rest of Blender. They keep the shortcuts fairly consistent between the different views. So if I select this one and hit the G key, I can move this around, or I can just click and drag, which is usually what I prefer. But I don't want a diffuse shader. Again, cans are made out of metal, so I want a glossy shader instead. If I hit the X key, that'll delete that instantly. Now because our material doesn't have any shader, it's not reflecting any light that's coming out of it, so it's essentially just a black hole. Photons go in, but they don't come out. So let's change that. Just like our Add Mesh keyboard shortcut, if I hit the Shift A key, it brings up our Add menu. And what I wanted to add was a glossy shader. Now we have all these different shaders that we can choose from. Right now we're just going to add glossy. And drag that up. I'm not holding the mouse key, it just does that automatically, and then click to place it. And click from the green BSDF over to the surface in our material output. And you can see that's looking a little bit more can-like. And if we select red for this now, it's looking a little bit better. Now I can play around with this, but what I want to do is show you another one that's quite useful. So I hit the X key, Shift A to add. In the shader menu, go down to Anisotropic and select. Connect the BSDF to surface. And this one looks a little bit more like aluminum. What anisotropic is the way that the light bounces off the metal and kind of scatters on the surface of the metal, and you get this kind of nice radial effect that comes off the can. And so I'm going to keep that. We can mess around with the options here, maybe drag the roughness down a little bit so it's a little bit more shiny. And now that we have this material, let's give it a proper name instead of material 01. I can change it here, I can change it here, or I can change it here. Just call this metal, or maybe aluminum. Okay, perfect. Also, our tab is made out of aluminum, so let's select that as well. And it does not have a material. So instead of selecting a new material to create, I'm going to drop down this menu and select from the ones that we already have created. So select that one, and now we have our can. For our platform here, or our table, let's say, if you select this one, it also does not have a material, so it's using the default material. So I'm going to create a material for our table, and I'm going to instead call this, instead of material, call it table. Hit enter. Now tables, they can be diffuse, they can be glossy, or they can be a combination between those two. So let me show you something kind of interesting. If I select this, move it up here, hit the Shift A keyboard shortcut to bring up our add menu, go down to shader, click on glossy, and select this one. Now if I add this one to the surface, you see it replaces what was in there already, but it adds a nice gloss to our table. But again, maybe I want a little bit of gloss, a little bit of diffuse. So we have to add a mixer in here to mix between this shader and this shader. So Shift A, shader, mix shader, and if I just drop it right on this line here, it'll connect that automatically. I'm going to drop that down to this one and this one as well, just to make it look nice. Now by changing this factor slider, I can make it more shiny or less shiny. And I can make the diffuse color, let's say red, and the glossy shader maybe blue or green. And it's going to mix those two with a ratio of about 40% diffuse, 46%, and it's going to mix the diffuse shader 46% and the remaining, namely 54% around that, to the glossy shader. The way I like to think about this is when you slide the factor to the left, it's going to this one, and when you're sliding it to the right, it goes to that one. Just, it's a weird kind of mapping that you have to do, but that's how that works. This factor slides left to favor this shader, as I can see if it'll start to turn red, and then as you slide it to the right, it'll favor this shader, which is glossy and green. So drag that back and forth, or you can enter in an actual value. Okay, let's give this one final render. Hit F12. Okay, here's our render. We can zoom out, we can pan it around by holding down the middle mouse button, and that's looking okay. I did notice that our light is a little dark, so let's hit escape to clean this up, and we can keep that in this view here. And let's go into one by making sure your mouse is over on this view. Zoom out, select our light. Now for lighting, there's two ways to make our light brighter. We can move it toward the can, because as the light moves away, it falls off at an exponential rate, or we can just make it brighter. So with our light selected, we can go over to the light menu, which just happens to be selected already. Go down to this menu, but right now it's using the old Blender render, so we want to use nodes to allow nodes to edit our light. So once we do that, you can see that our view didn't change here, but there's a little bug in Blender that sometimes doesn't center on it. So if we zoom out, middle click and drag, you can now see that material that's on our light. And right now it's just an emission shader. And what emission shader is it emits photons. You can see that this node has a strength of 100. We can change that down here as well, or we can do it in this one. Depends upon if you have this window open or not. So I'm just going to drag that up until our scene gets a little bit brighter, or maybe I'll just add in about 300 should be good. Yeah, that's nice and bright. So hit F12. Alright, so that's looking a lot better. One last thing I want to show you for the lighting, if we hit escape, is the size of it. Now, let's move this over so you can see the shadow a little bit better. Maybe zoom out a little bit. With our light selected, go over to the size option here and increase that 0.5. As the light gets bigger, it makes our shadows softer. This is because the larger our light source, the more that it bounces and wraps around our object and does other crazy things like that. So for softer lighting, you want larger lights. For more dramatic, sharper shadows, smaller lights are a lot better. So if we change that to 0.01, you can see we have a very, very harsh, hard-edged shadow. So the values you choose here are really up to you. I'm going to go something a little bit in between, about 0.3. Get a nice feathering effect on our shadow there. Maybe turn up the strength just a little bit on this, and we're going to render this out. I'm happy with this result right here. There's a lot of things I could change and spend all day on, but for right now this is okay to show you guys. The final thing that I wanted to show you is if you zoom in a little bit here, you can kind of see that this table and our model is a little bit fuzzy and it kind of has this noise going on here. Let's do the sample rate of Cycles. If you noticed, as you were rendering, Cycles was creating all these little tiny dots, and initially it looked very fuzzy and then it kind of came into focus. Well, we can extend that period where it comes more and more and more into focus by increasing the cycle sample rate. To do that, we go over to our render menu, which is this camera, and going down until you see sampling, and scrolling down until you see rendering. And right now it's 128 and the preview is 32. Preview represents the number of samples that our preview will take, which is this guy here on the left, and render is when we actually hit the render button, what this will look like. So our samples are a little bit low for this kind of shader. The shader is very, very intense, so it requires a lot more samples to accomplish a really smooth effect. So I'm going to change this from 128 to 512. You can see on my computer, this last render took about 25 seconds. With 512 samples, it's going to take a lot longer. So let's see what that looks like now. Select off of that to save it, to enter those samples in, and then hit F12. Now that our render is complete, you can see that our can looks a little bit cleaner, but it did take almost 4 times the amount of time to render at 512 samples than it did 128. So just keep in mind, when we're building these models out, we usually keep our sample rate low just to get a preview, and then when we're ready for our final high resolution render, we up those samples to get every little tiny nook and cranny of this model and really hit every surface multiple times, as many as we can, so that those photons that are bouncing back off of our object, hitting our camera, give us a truly high resolution image. Cycles Render represents a physically based rendering engine, and with the node editor you can get complex materials that are based on actual physics that look indistinguishable from their real life counterparts. So once you get good at modeling, there's a whole nother field of study in just lighting and materials, not to mention texturing, animation, and more. But that's what I'll leave you guys. Make sure you practice on your own. Think of some basic objects that you can model. Don't get too ambitious. Maybe try modeling your cell phone, a GoPro camera, or anything that has a basic, simple shape to it. Practice makes perfect, so make sure you're modeling all the time. The way that I got good was I sat down for 30 days and I made a model every single day. Now, every once in a while I'd skip a day, but the point was to create as much as you can, as often as you can. And you'll be surprised at how quickly you become an excellent modeler. If you like this video, make sure you click that button, and if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And finally, make sure you visit us at electronicarmory.com for all things electronic, including Android tutorials, iOS tutorials, tutorials on electrical engineering such as Raspberry Pi, Arduino, and more, and everything else to arm yourself in the digital world. We'll see you next time. Thanks.